with the Biden administration struggling to extricate itself from the embarrassment of the cakewalk victory of the Taliban over Kabul, the criticism of President Joe Biden's handling of the US troops' withdrawal is mounting. Even as the president remains steadfast in his assertion that the withdrawal was the right move, there are those who are seriously castigating his policy. Former US National Security Advisor John Bolton has called the takeover of Afghanistan a catastrophic failure of American leadership and also called it the Trump-Biden policy. He has said Biden simply continued former President Donald Trump's erroneous policy and compounded it by bungling it. Bolton, a former US ambassador to the United Nations, says Washington should not rush to recognize any Taliban government in Kabul. He spoke to Mayank Chhaya Reports from Washington. Ambassador John Bolton. You've said that President Biden continued Donald Trump's policy on Afghanistan and then compounded it by bungling it. Is there really a right policy on Afghanistan?
Well, I think the right policy was not to withdraw. I think that as difficult as this has been for 20 years, and even given mistakes we've made, and I think we've made a number of mistakes, including the so-called nation-building project, the fact is that there was a strategic American interest in having a sufficient military presence in Afghanistan and an intelligence presence as well to forestall the return of the Taliban. And what I fear is the near certainty that Taliban will invite in again Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others who've never really left them. There have been Al-Qaeda personnel in and around Afghanistan with the Taliban in Pakistan for the last 20 years. ISIS has taken root there, but I think the real risk of them coming back in more substantial numbers is apparent. I mean, there have been reports, and I'll concede they're not confirmed, but reports already of 10,000 foreign fighters in Afghanistan. This will have an incredibly detrimental effect, obviously, on the people of Afghanistan immediately. I think it will have a potential follow-on effect in Pakistan. If you have sort of the reverse of Taliban taking root in Pakistan, now they control Afghanistan and can give comfort to those in Pakistan that would seek a more militant government. And if Pakistan's government fell to extremists, we would all face a terrorist government with nuclear weapons, which is obviously unacceptable. And I fear if Al-Qaeda and ISIS come back, the terrorist threat that we saw before 9/11 will be back as well. So it's a pretty discouraging picture, and I think it has larger implications for views of the resolve of the Biden administration and the West more generally around the world, in Moscow and Beijing and plenty of other places too.
You've called this a catastrophic failure of American leadership. What is the redemption from that really at this stage?
Well, I think that we'll see how developments transpire in Afghanistan, but I think the willingness of the Biden administration to walk away from 20 years of effort and essentially to say to NATO, we're not going to support your presence in the country, which had been largely devoted to training and assisting the Afghan army, also sends a signal to people in other countries, small countries in particular, Taiwan, Ukraine, Belarus, but to many other American allies. It's not just our adversaries I worry about, that again, we are overcome with short-term interests, such that even a withdrawal, whatever you think of that, and as I say, I oppose it, but it was not well planned, it was not well executed. You can't look at the scenes from Kabul airport and not conclude that there's a series of big mistakes made here. So anytime you get these images of an American leadership that's inadequate, from the U.S. perspective certainly, but from the perspective of our friends around the world, it has to be very troubling.
I assure you, I do not sit in a posh cafe in Chicago when I say this. But is there any other option apart from now dealing with the Taliban as the de facto government in Afghanistan? What is the way out?
for anyone.
I think when Taliban took control before, certainly the U.S. didn't recognize them. Very few countries actually did recognize the Taliban regime. And I think that should be the appropriate posture beginning right now and extending until we see what their performance is. You know, then in Doha and in their first press conference from Kabul, they had their smiley faces on. Everything's going to be fine, they said. What really could go wrong? You know, we're all speculating about the future, but even when Taliban spokesmen say that they will respect the civil rights of women and girls, they then go on to say within Sharia law. One of their spokesmen just a few hours ago said that there's not going to be any democracy in Afghanistan. It was going to be according to Sharia law as interpreted by Taliban. So I think that's not a good sign. We know what their interpretation was before. There's no evidence they've changed it other than their assertion that they're different. I think they've got better public relations advice now than they had before. But look, for all of us who are outsiders, it's speculation. We can, however, ask what the people of Afghanistan think. Right. And the evidence there is tens of thousands of them want to leave, and many others are desperately worried about what's going to happen to them.
Do you see any prospects of someone like the former Vice President Amrullah Saleh and Ahmad Massoud, the son of the famed anti-Soviet commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, joining hands into some kind of significant resistance to the Taliban?
Well, the statements I've heard from Ahmad Massoud in particular is that he wants peace for his country, but he doesn't intend to live in a country run by the Taliban as they ran it before. So I think that's probably, from a practical point of view, the best they can do in the current circumstances. We'll have a debate for a long time how we should have foreseen the collapse of the Afghan government, which obviously occurred very swiftly. And it may well be that leaders, potentially anti-Taliban leaders inside Afghanistan didn't see it coming this soon either, so that a lot of people are not prepared. I just think, given the statements that Taliban have made over the years and the history of their rule when they were in power, should tell us at the beginning to be deeply skeptical of any rhetoric that says, "Oh, we're changed now. We really just want to go to meetings in Paris to discuss climate change." I just don't see the evidence for it at this point.
One of the most contentious issues has been the size of the so-called Afghan armed force trained by the U.S. The number 300,000 has been contested by someone even like Ahmad Massoud, who has called it a lie, and he says it's in a sense symbolic of the corruption that happened in Afghanistan. What do you think?
Well, I'm worried he may be right. The actual number of trained people as opposed to ghost soldiers may be very high. But I also have to say, over 20 years, a lot of Afghan soldiers, Afghan police, other security forces have died fighting Taliban. It is wrong to say that they weren't prepared to try. They were. But I think at the end here, knowing that the U.S. was pulling out, the Air Force would be gone, the intelligence support would be gone, and frankly, the U.S. as the defender of last resort would be gone too when we pulled out, had a devastating effect on their morale. It's not unique in history that a small group of dedicated fanatics can beat a much larger military force, because they've terrorized them. And I think Taliban's record is a terrorist record. But probably most importantly, look, when people build an arch, they put a keystone at the top of it. When the keystone is taken away, the arch can be very big, but it will still fall. And I think that's what's happened here with the loss of the U.S. It was inevitable, and it turns out it was inevitable very quickly that the Afghan military would collapse.
In a sense, President Biden has argued that given that he was locked in by the agreement that President Trump signed for withdrawal by May 1st, do you think he had a choice to undo it and do something else?
Yeah, absolutely he had a choice. This is an irony that Trump and Biden both favored withdrawal of American military forces. Biden has favored that since 2009, at least, if not before. So this is not some newfound revelation. It wasn't an election conversion kind of thing. This is what he's believed for a long time. But he's been confronted with other decisions Trump has made. He is still trying to get back into the misbegotten 2015 Iran nuclear deal that Trump withdrew from in really a U.S. context, but Biden revoked an agreement with Canada dealing with the Keystone XL pipeline that Trump had put in place. And even with the deal with the Taliban, my recollection is that the agreed upon withdrawal date under the Trump agreement was May 1. Biden extended that until September 11, now August 31. So he did have a choice. And look, in a democratic society, the new government has a choice to change policies that they consider detrimental to American national security. If Biden had disagreed with Trump, he should have changed it. He didn't change it because he agreed with it. So there, as you said at the beginning, there are really two issues here, and both mistakes in my view. One issue is, should we withdraw? On that, Trump and Biden see eye to eye. I've said it's like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. The second issue is the decision to withdraw being implemented correctly? And sadly, the answer there is absolutely not.
In your mind, is there an Afghanistan which you think will not require any kind of serious U.S. presence? Or do you think it's a perpetual thing that we'll have to live with it?
Well, as long as the terrorist threat exists, I think it's an insurance policy for the United States and others not to allow Taliban to take back over and provide privileged sanctuaries, safe rear areas for terrorists who have international aspirations like ISIS and Al Qaeda to develop. I think terrorists we see now in Libya, in Western Iraq, and Eastern Syria, they've gone there because they're zones of anarchy. There's nobody to control them. But a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan would not be anarchic. It would foster security for terrorists, and I think it's almost inevitable they would try to gravitate there. India certainly has known its share of this kind of terrorism. This has to be worrying for many countries around the world.
With China already making the moves with the Taliban, they invited a Taliban delegation recently. And given the fact that Beijing has a total lack of reformative impulses when it comes to dealing with any country in the world, what do you think China's involvement does for the rest of the world?
Well, look, the withdrawal of U.S. and NATO forces leaves a big hole in the center of Central Asia. And somebody's going to move in to fill that void. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be for the better for other countries. China has one, I think, very specific interest. They want to make sure that radicalism and support for terrorism doesn't flow out of Afghanistan through the Wakhan corridor into Xinjiang province. I'm sure that they're willing to pay for that in effect. But I think they'll have other objectives. I think they'll see this as another way to extend their influence through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's another path around Central Asia. I think the Russians also see an opportunity for extending their influence here. So it's not that outside powers will simply leave the Taliban alone. I think it's going to be the wrong kind of outside powers protecting their own interests, to be sure, but also trying to have a broader influence along Afghanistan's periphery.
In this context, where do you see India fitting in? With China already there, what role do you think India can play?
Well, I think India has to make a judgment where they think their security interests lie, and I can understand that some would argue, well, that means we should engage with Taliban. I don't see that as a winning argument. I think considering what the Chinese are up to necessarily has to be on the table for India, because yet another country that comes under Chinese influence is something that has to be concerning. But I think the main issue here for India is Pakistan. And we know about China's influence there, and we know what Pakistan's nuclear capabilities are, and its role, frankly, in supporting Taliban from ISI and other sources. I think we all have to look now very carefully at what we think the stability of the Pakistani government is, and what could happen there, and what additional influence China may gain. It's really, don't mean to repeat myself, but I do think internationally it's what happens in Pakistan that may turn out over the long run to be more important than what has just happened in Afghanistan.
Speaking of Pakistan, Prime Minister Imran Khan appears to have taken a somewhat confusing position. Earlier, he seemed to be okay with the Taliban being fought off, but now he's saying, he's gone on record to say that it's sort of they've broken the shackles of slavery. What do you think is going on there? I mean, Islamabad has to take a clear position on this.
Yeah, look, the United States' presence in Afghanistan had nothing to do with slavery or imperialism or anything of the sort, nor did the other NATO and other coalition participants in a variety of different ways. This is a potentially serious problem, but I can say honestly, I'm a private citizen now. What matters in Pakistan is where the military comes out. We know all too well what the ISI's position is. I think this is going to require some very serious conversation with the top of the military, and I expect our Defense Department will be engaged in that very quickly. I think it's important. I don't think we have a lot of time to waste here. And I would say to the military in Pakistan that don't want to see a radical pro-terrorist regime take over the country, you don't have a lot of time either.
Don't you think domestically the withdrawal, however fraught it has been, plays very well for President Biden, because there is about 70% support for complete withdrawal?
No, I don't agree with that, and I'll tell you why. Number one, I think whatever people's position is on military withdrawal, nobody likes to see the U.S. humiliated. Nobody likes to see scenes of desperate people clinging to parts of a C-17 cargo. Nobody likes to see the fear in people's eyes that they're going to be trapped in a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Nobody likes to see the U.S. walk away in that kind of manner. And that's why I think Biden's mishandling of the withdrawal in itself is a serious problem for him internationally, but domestically as well. But I must tell you, there's also polling just done over the weekend and reflective of other polling. It's one thing to say, do you want to get out of this endless war? Large numbers of Americans say yes. But then this poll said, well, if we withdraw and Taliban take over, what do you think of that? And the numbers changed dramatically. At that point, 38% only favor withdrawal, 45% oppose withdrawal. And then the next question was asked, well, if we withdraw and al-Qaeda come back, what do you think of that? And the numbers change again, down to 35% favoring withdrawal and 48% opposing it. So I think just in this flash that we've had over the weekend, the American people have understood the strategic significance. And if the cost of withdrawing is Taliban taking back over and al-Qaeda returning, Taliban taking back over is now a certainty. Al-Qaeda returning, I think, a probability. The balance changes very dramatically, and this is a huge risk for Biden politically. And I think the evidence of that is already clear within the Democratic Party. There are dramatic splits over his decision, certainly over the way it was implemented. Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, former director of the CIA, very strongly against this withdrawal. So there's enormous concern among Democrats in Congress. They face an election next year. They're already worried about how it's going to go. This is not good news for them.
And finally, to play the devil's advocate, doesn't the Taliban have the incentive at this point, when they are trying the second time around, to at least superficially change enough so that the international community can live with their dispensation?
No, I think that's right. And I do think their public relations advice is much better now than it was 20 years ago. But never forget what the great circus entrepreneur P.T. Barnum once said, there's a sucker born every minute. And the Taliban are counting on P.T. Barnum being right. I hope we see through it.
On that rather humorous note, I want to thank you for your time, Mr. Bolton. Just about in 20 minutes, we finished it.
Well, I appreciate your having me on again. Good
No,
talk.
I'm grateful that you always find the time, truly, and thank you very much. I'll send you the links.
Okay, that'd be great. Have a good
Thank
day.
you. You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.